Now I know this is a video that I'm sure many people will disagree with me over, but it's kind of a topic that I feel like needs to be talked about at some point, by someone, at least. And just get into what the video is about. I think we need to stop using the term queerbaiting, at least use it significantly less than we currently use it for. And just to say this at the start, I am talking about queerbaiting with fiction. Queerbaiting with real people is a completely different can of worms that I'm not going to get into, other than just saying, like, you definitely shouldn't use the term queerbaiting to refer to real people. But I don't want to talk about that. Other people have talked about that. I'm talking about works of fiction. But what is queerbaiting? I suppose we'll just ask Wikipedia, and we'll read what Wikipedia says about that. So according to Wikipedia, queerbaiting is a marketing technique for fiction and entertainment in which creators hint at, but do not depict, same-sex romance or other LGBTQ+ representation. The purpose of this method is to attract, bait, a queer or straight ally audience with the suggestion or possibility of relationships or characters that appeal to them, while not alienating homophobic members of the audience or censors by actually portraying queer relationships. And right here we have a picture of BBC's Sherlock, which personally I think is an absolutely terrible example of queerbaiting, which we're going to get into. But just to go back to the definition, here are the important aspects of it. 1. They hint at same-sex romance or other LGBTQ+ representation. 2. They do not depict same-sex romance or other LGBTQ+ representation. And 3. The purpose of it is to attract a queer audience while not alienating homophobes. Okay. Those are the 3 core pillars of what queerbaiting means. Now, if we look at the way that people talk about queerbaiting when it comes to fiction, most of the time when they're saying the term queerbaiting, it doesn't fit into those 3 pillars of the definition. And similarly, I think there are 3 aspects of the way that people talk about queerbaiting that I take issue with. And those 3 issues are, 1, sometimes there is just a very homophobic TV show that we accuse of queerbaiting, even though there is a much bigger discussion to be had about the homophobia in that TV show. Like, queerbaiting is one small aspect of the homophobia in the show, and yet it ends up being the only thing that people talk about, and it completely comes to define the way that people talk about it, which I think reduces the discussion around it in a very bad way. And 2, very, very commonly, I think it also is an issue of people interpreting something as romantic that is not meant to be interpreted as romantic. And 3, the third issue is probably the biggest one, which is people just completely discredit different queer storylines if they don't fit into the small definition of what they think a queer storyline should look like. And by that, I don't mean the storyline is homophobic. I mean, people just want a very simple romance. Now, to go into the 3 issues that I take with the way people talk about queerbaiting, we're just going to go through them one by one. And the first one is that people reduce the conversation around just directly homophobic shows by accusing it of queerbaiting, which goes against that 3rd pillar of the definition, where they're trying to attract a queer audience and not alienate homophobes. So, okay, let's look at Sherlock, for example. On Sherlock, a lesbian falls in love with a man, which is homophobic, right? Like, sure, you can interpret her as bisexual, but here is how Stephen Moffat was talking about bisexual representation on TV around that same time. I don't think he intends for you to think Irene Adler is bisexual. I think he intends for you to think she's a lesbian who falls in love with Sherlock, and I don't think he means for that to be a bisexual storyline. I think it's just homophobia, right? And then most of the examples that people will give to you for talking about how there is queerbaiting on Sherlock could be more accurately described as just homophobic intent, I would say, and not queerbaiting. I would say they're kind of doing the opposite of queerbaiting, because they're trying to alienate their queer audience instead of attracting one, because oftentimes it is other characters asking Sherlock and John if they are a couple, and then Sherlock and John being disgusted by the notion, and basically saying, like, hello, audience, please stop saying we're gay, because we're not, and we don't want you to think we are. And that did start in the first season, before the audience started saying that, so I don't really think there's any way you can really defend that other than it just being homophobic intent. I mean, there's even a very explicit example of them saying, hey, audience, we think it is stupid of you to say these characters are gay, considering they have an in-universe person suggesting that Sherlock survives the fall by being the gay lover of Moriarty, and they actively ridicule that idea on the show. So they're actively ridiculing the audience that says there are gay characters on the show, right? This is just a homophobic show. It's not queerbaiting you. Now, I know I talked about Stephen Moffat there, and I know he has a very loyal fan base, so I'm going to say this right now, that I don't think he's, like, a terribly homophobic person. I think his biggest issue as a writer is that when he gets criticism, he addresses it in all of the wrong ways. Like when people accuse him of writing female characters as being too sexy, he just kind of writes them as dominatrixes. Dominant women who wear black, and like, sure, you're just kind of changing the way that you're changing the way you're writing them, but like I think we can all deduce that you're just attracted to women like that, and you're still writing in that exact same realm of female characters have to be attractive, just in a different way. So like I think when these accusations of queerbaiting started to show up, he tried to address it, and he kind of just made it all worse. And I should also mention that the other main writer of Sherlock was Mark Gatiss. He's gay, so people say, like, there's no way you can accuse him of being homophobic, and yet he was directly involved in the episode of Doctor Who in which the Doctor sexually assaults a lesbian, and they kind of try to just play that off for laughs. Now, to be fair to Gatiss, that was Matt Smith improving that bit, which is another can of worms we're not going to get into. But you can just cut that out of the finished episode, you know? You don't have to leave that in there. You really shouldn't. Mark Gatiss is involved with homophobic content very regularly, so like him being gay doesn't change that. Now, the other main example people will give you of queerbaiting would be Supernatural, which also fits into this exact same issue where we're reducing conversations about homophobia down to queerbaiting, when in reality the show is kind of trying to alienate their queer audience. Or they're just being homophobic in other ways. Like, Charlie Bradbury was on the show for several seasons until they decided she had to die a very bloody death and they left her bloody corpse in a bathtub. So the main dudes can be angsty over her death, because on this show, every single character who is not one of those three main characters has to die so that those three main characters can angst over it. And guess what? Those three main characters, at least for most of the runtime of the show, are portrayed as heterosexual white men. So all of the minority characters get to be brutally murdered. And that's their entire purpose on the show. And sure, at the end of the show, they had Castiel proclaim his love for Dean, and then they murdered him immediately. So like, there's a very big discussion to be had about that show being homophobic. And we just kind of accuse it of queerbaiting, even though, like, I think it's pretty obvious they want homophobes to watch the show, and I don't really think they want queer people to. Like, a few different times on the show, they have gay characters show up for one episode, and them being gay is the joke of the episode. Like, very explicitly, they just joke about it. And hey, they did that exact same thing that Sherlock did, where they had an episode where they very explicitly made fun of the audience thinking the characters were gay. Although in this case, they were making fun of the incest strippers. So I will say that they're valid in making fun of incest strippers, but they are still ultimately making fun of the audience for saying characters are gay, right? And then the second main issue that I have with accusations of queerbaiting is that people interpret things as romantic that really don't seem like they're supposed to be interpreted as romantic. You know, I would say Sherlock and Supernatural are good examples of that as well. Honestly, I feel like maybe Stephen Moffat's not very good at writing platonic relationships. I don't mean to hate on him too much, but I mean, you look at his era of Doctor Who, there's not a lot of platonic relationships in there. He really likes writing romance a lot more, so when you ask him to write platonic relationship, he maybe doesn't do it very well, in which case it kind of makes it a bit easier for people to interpret it as romantic, even if I don't think the intention is really there. I mean, going back to him writing lesbian characters, weird, he even has Bill Potts on Doctor Who is a lesbian, say she would make out with the Doctor if she met back up with him. Assuming he's a woman now, which is a truly bizarre thing to have a lesbian character say, I gotta say. That's in like a mini episode they put on YouTube during the lockdown, if you haven't heard of it. But yeah, she very explicitly says she would make out with the Doctor if they met back up with each other. As long as he's a woman, which is weird. So even when the Doctor is friends with a lesbian, he can't even really keep that platonic. Because he's just bad at that. Supernatural, I think also, I don't think they were ever intending for Dean and Cass to seem to be attracted to each other. I think people just really got hung up on that idea. And now you look at the other half of the Supernatural fanbase who ships Dean and Sam together. That pretty clearly indicates that this fanbase has a knack for interpreting familial relationships as romantic, so I can certainly understand that the other half of the fanbase also interprets platonic love as romantic. Teen Wolf is also another example. People often say that Styles and Derek on Teen Wolf seem to be attracted to each other, but I mean, I hope not, considering Styles is 16 when the show starts and Derek is 23. We would have to have a pretty big conversation about that show if the writers intended for you to interpret them as being attracted to each other right from the start, which is what the fanbase says. They do say from the start. And also, I think people in general interpret things as romantic that are supposed to be platonic in works of fiction all the time. It's not specifically only same-gender relationships that people interpret that way. It's kind of just like everything. Any example you can ever think of in a work of fiction where you see platonic love between two people, there are probably a lot of people that think that's romantic. Another example would be the MCU. Steve and Bucky, they are that's a brotherly love right there. It's not romantic at all, but people call it romantic because they cannot comprehend the concept that maybe sometimes fictional characters have platonic love for each other. Platonic love is a real thing. I feel like society in general is kind of trying to tell people love can only be romantic, and that's probably where this issue comes from. But then it ends up leading to people being overly combative when they're engaging with fiction because they interpret any same-gender platonic love as romantic, which then makes them accuse it of queerbaiting, which then opens up a can of worms, and we need to keep those cans of worms closed. That's what we're doing here today, okay? And then the big issue, the third issue that I have with academics of queerbaiting is very, very, very commonly they are just looking at what is explicitly a queer storyline with queer characters, and they are saying it is queerbaiting, even though the show itself directly tells you these are queer characters. The 13th Doctor and Yasmin Khan on Doctor Who very explicitly talk to each other about how they have feelings for each other. There's like 3 different episodes in which they explicitly talk about their feelings. These are explicit queer characters, and people call it queerbaiting because they don't get together, because the Doctor doesn't want to have a romance at this point in her life, because the last couple of romances she's had ended absolutely terribly, so she doesn't want to go through that again right now. And that's not queerbaiting, that's a queer storyline. It's very explicitly a queer storyline, so please stop calling it queerbaiting. People also call it queerbaiting because Yasmin Khan doesn't say if she's gay or bi, but like, we know she's attracted to women, and her entire storyline is that the 13th Doctor was the first woman she was attracted to. So yeah, she doesn't say what her label is, because she hasn't figured that out yet. That is the storyline that they are telling, and telling storylines like this is a good thing. We need to encourage that, not discourage it. That exact same thing happened on Gotham, a TV show about Gotham before Batman showed up. The Penguin, Oswald Cobblepot, very explicitly talks about being attracted to the Riddler, Edward Dagba, and they don't get together because the Riddler is straight while the Penguin is gay. Again, that is a queer storyline. There is a queer character in there. Telling stories like that is good because real people go through that, right? It's not bad to tell these stories. And then there's a lot of other different queer storylines you can tell. Like, for example, how would you write a slow burn gay romance where the characters are coming to terms with their sexuality and not have accusations of queerbaiting show up as you're writing that? Because if you don't have it be explicit until, let's say, the final episode of the first season, people will be saying they were worried that the show was just going to queerbait them. This is not hypothetical. This is how people talked about Our Flag Means Death. Because there is not a kissing scene until the final episode, people were worried it was going to be queerbaiting, because they cannot appreciate a slow burn queer romance because they're so hung up on this concept of queerbaiting. And then, of course, there is the issue with people saying bisexual characters queerbait by dating people of different genders. And, this happens a lot in fiction, obviously. But that's not queerbaiting. That is a queer character. That is a bisexual character. I do think sometimes there's a bigger discussion to be had around how bisexual characters are written. Like, if you just have them say they're bisexual in one scene, and then you otherwise write them as heterosexual. There's a conversation to be had there, but that conversation should not be simplified down to they have to date someone of the same gender in order for those to count as queer representation. Because no, bisexual people do date people of different genders. That doesn't prevent them from being bisexual, but they don't have to date someone of the same gender in order to count as queer representation. They just have to be actively written as queer, which they are by being bisexual. And sometimes there are gay characters who are only written as gay for a single scene, and then they just never mention it ever again, such as The Rise of Skywalker. There's one scene where they kiss, and that is it, so that we can just cut that one scene out. So, writing a queer character only as queer in one scene and otherwise writing them as ambiguous is an issue. I will say that. And that's not an issue that is specifically only done with bisexual characters. But to get back on topic, sometimes you also have a show where, there's so much queer representation on it, but then this one romance doesn't get together, therefore this show is homophobic and it queerbaits. For example, Supergirl. People wanted Kara Danvers and Lena Luthor to get together, and they never did. However, this is the same show that has Alex Danvers, who has multiple love interests over the course of the show, Maggie Sawyer and Kelly Olsen being her main two romances. And then we also have the best DC character ever made, Nia Nal, who is a trans woman, played by Nicole Maines, who is a trans woman. There is LGBTQ plus representation on the show, so the show is obviously not trying to attract a queer audience while not alienating homophobes, because it is alienating homophobes by having other queer representation on the show, right? It's just that with Kara and Lena, their attraction, I think you're probably supposed to interpret them as being attracted to each other, but they just keep it subtle storytelling over the course of the entire show. And obviously people think that queer storytelling needs to never be subtle, which is a thing I disagree with personally. I'll get into that in a little bit. But even if you disagree with the way that those two characters are written, there is queer representation on the show, so, you're just kind of... So by saying this show is queerbaiting, with the definition of queerbaiting being that they hint at LGBTQ plus representation, but never depict it, you're discrediting the queer representation that does exist on that show. Other examples. Teen Wolf, which I mentioned earlier, also had explicit queer representation. Gotham also had more than just Penguin. It had Barbara Keene and Tabitha Gallivan, who were an on-again, off-again romance over the course of that entire show. Supernatural did also have queer representation on it. There's a lot of issues to be had with that representation, but it did have it, nonetheless. And I would circle back to what I mentioned about subtle queer storytelling. I don't think we should completely demonize the concept of subtle queer storytelling, especially because I think queer storytelling really lends itself to subtle storytelling. Because sometimes people don't come out of the closet at early stages in their life. So having that subtle storytelling, I think, is perfectly fine. And, for example, Legend of Korra. That was subtle storytelling over the course of the final season of the show, that Korra and Asami were attracted to each other. It's never made explicit on the show itself. There are comics from after the show ended that make it more explicit, but in the show itself, it was always subtle. Now, again, there's another can of worms there, where the reason why it was subtle was because the executives in charge didn't want it to be explicit. So, yeah, that's bad, obviously. However, that doesn't mean we can't appreciate the storytelling that did go into that show, right? However, that doesn't mean we should yell at the writers and say that the writers were homophobic because they kept it subtle. Now, when we look at Supergirl, we yell at the writers and we tell them that they're homophobic because they kept this one thing subtle, even though in every single Arrowverse show, they were never allowed to take a character who, in the comics, isn't explicitly queer themselves and then make them queer in the show. Anytime they did have a queer character, it was either a new character that they created themselves, or it was one that was already queer in the comics. And Supergirl is complicated in that discussion, but the main universe version of Supergirl in the comics hasn't had a romance with another woman. She has in other universes, but never the main universe. So they probably didn't have permission to do it, which is probably why they just kept it subtle, and they had many, many examples of Kara and Lena acting like Superman and Lois Lane and stuff like that. Because they want to tell you, like, hey, we're giving you these characters so that you can interpret them as queer, but we're not allowed to say that they are. And I think that's really the thing to look at, is that sometimes the writers are giving the fan base a character that the fan base is supposed to interpret as queer and tell their own stories with them. And I think that's a good thing. You know, I like it when they do stuff like that. Because people like to have a canon first relationship with fiction, where the official canon is like the only thing that ultimately matters. But then they turn around and make fan art and fan fiction and other fan works that diverge from the official canon. And personally, I think in many cases, you know, the fan works are what come to define the public perception of the show, more so than the official canon. So I think giving these subtle queer storylines so that the fan base can then expand upon it is a beautiful thing. And I think we should thank writers for giving us that, instead of calling them homophobic, personally. You know, obviously I don't want every single queer character to be kept to subtle storytelling, but that doesn't mean none of them should be given that. Like, there's this whole idea that people tend to have where every single queer character must exist to be a statement, and every single queer character has to loudly proclaim that they're queer from the rooftops and stuff like that. And I 100% disagree with that concept. Personally, the queer characters that I enjoy in fiction try their best to avoid being these loud statements, because I feel like when you're making them to be loud statements, you oftentimes stop writing them as people, and you instead write them to be statements. And I really don't like when characters are reduced to being statements over being characters. Like the 13th Doctor and Yasmin Khan obviously do not exist to be statements, they exist to be characters first. And I like that. I want more of that. That is the queer storytelling that I want. I don't want queer characters to be like they are in The Rise of Skywalker, where they exist to be a statement, and that's it. They don't exist to tell a story about queer people. They exist to be a statement. You know, obviously you can make queer characters who are both statements and are still treated like people, but personally I would say if you have to pick one or the other, I would pick writing them as people first, not as statements. So just to sum it up, basically I think queerbaiting at this point in time has become a nothing burger, because it's used to describe many different things, many of which do not fit under the official definition of what queerbaiting is supposed to mean. It's like, it doesn't mean anything. It's a word that has no meaning because it means many different things. And then I think a lot of the many different things that it is used to mean are just people being overly combative with the way that they engage with media, which ultimately I think is going to scare writers away from writing queer storylines. Especially when we're saying that queer storyline that you told is a bad thing that you should not have done, because it is not a by-the-numbers romance. Writers will ultimately just decide it's better for them to not write a queer character if you're telling them, like, exploring a complex relationship between two characters is a bad thing. You know, with how toxic people have been towards Chris Chibnall over the way he wrote 13th Doctor and Yasmin Khan, maybe he's just not going to write more queer characters, because he wants to write them as people and not as statements. And writing them as people, apparently, is bad, because you can't have a queer person who doesn't want to have a romance because they've had bad romances in the past. Okay, so you can't write queer characters as people, right? Because that's what he did. Obviously, people are toxic towards him for like 20 different reasons. But that is one of the reasons why they absolutely hate his guts. And I think one of the main things we're missing in these discussions is also just that, like, there are real queer people who do not state that they're queer constantly, who do not have romances at every waking moment of their life. So I think if we're saying it's a bad thing to have queer characters that represent the wide berth of what it is to be queer, then you are hurting queer representation by saying that. You're not helping it. Because, you know, some people stay in the closet their whole life, or like into their 30s, and many TV show characters are in their 20s, and we have shows where people don't know what label they want to use yet, and we're saying that's a bad thing. And like, there are real queer people who struggle with figuring out what label they want to use. Stuff like that. Like, we should want queer representation that is like real queer people. That is the goal, right? Or am I the only one that wants queer characters to be like real queer people and not exist to the end of time to just be statements from companies saying, hey, look, we support gay people except for when we fund politicians that are trying to murder you. We support you in fiction, not in real life. Right? We don't want to be statements. We want to be people. Please write us as people. So yeah, please stop using the term queerbaiting. At least only use it when you're absolutely certain the thing you were talking about fits into the exact definition of queerbaiting. And like, I mean, to be honest, I don't know if there are actual examples that fit into the actual supposed definition of queerbaiting. Pretty much everything I've seen doesn't fit one of the 3 categories that I outlined of the definition. So yeah, please stop using the term queerbaiting so much, because you are actively harming queer representation by being so caught up on that word. And then sometimes you're just kind of letting writers off with being very openly homophobic on their shows, because you instead want to accuse them of queerbaiting, instead of having the bigger conversation of all the ways in which that show is homophobic or otherwise not supportive of marginalized people. Yeah, that's about all I have to say. Please just have honest conversations about queer representation instead of summing everything up into the term of queerbaiting when they don't all fit there. Anyways, bye. See you next time.